Let me tell you something most people spend half their life refusing to face. The world is not watching you the way you think it is. That text you're waiting for. That apology you keep hoping will finally come. That moment when someone is supposed to realize your value, regret how they treated you, and come back with clarity in their voice. Most of the time, it never happens the way you imagined. And that hurts. Not because you are weak. Not because you care too much. But because somewhere along the way, you were taught a lie. You were taught that if you were patient enough, kind enough, understanding enough, useful enough, people would eventually see your heart correctly. That they would feel the weight of your silence. That they would notice your effort. That they would understand what you meant, what you sacrificed, what you endured. But real life is colder than that. Most people are too busy protecting their own ego, feeding their own hunger, surviving their own private chaos, to study your pain with the depth you hope for. And once you truly understand that, something inside you breaks. But something else begins to form. Because this is where the game changes. The man who keeps waiting to be understood becomes dependent. The man who learns to stand without explanation becomes dangerous in a way the world immediately feels. Machiavelli understood this long before modern life gave us phones, social media, office politics, and relationships built on mixed signals. He understood that people do not reward the one who quietly hopes to be recognized. They test him. They delay him. They misunderstand him. And if he keeps chasing their understanding, they learn something important. He can be controlled. The Stoics saw the same truth from a deeper angle. Marcus Aurelius did not become strong because the world treated him gently. He became strong because he stopped expecting the world to carry his inner life for him. And that is exactly where most people suffer now. Not in public. Not dramatically. But privately. In the 5 seconds after sending a message. In the silence after being ignored. In the hours spent replaying a conversation that the other person has already forgotten. In the quiet humiliation of realizing you cared more than they did. In the exhausting habit of trying to explain yourself to people who were never trying to understand you in the first place. That is where people lose years of their lives. Not in one catastrophic moment. But in tiny leaks of attention. A little more energy spent checking the phone. A little more self-respect traded for one more explanation. A little more dignity sacrificed to keep a relationship, a friendship, a job, or an image alive. And over time, those little leaks become a life. A life built around reactions. A life built around approval. A life built around an invisible audience that is nowhere near as invested in you as you are. So here is the question this video asks. What happens when you finally stop building your peace on people who were never stable enough to hold it? What happens when you stop performing? Stop over-explaining? Stop waiting for closure? Stop confusing attention with love, politeness with respect, and temporary validation with real worth? What happens when your energy comes back home? Because that is what this conversation is really about. Not becoming cold. Not becoming bitter. Not pretending you do not feel pain. But becoming so internally grounded that other people's inconsistency no longer has the power to rearrange your mind. In this video, we are going to uncover why most people care far less than you think, why chasing understanding makes you weaker, why silence changes every power dynamic, and why the life that becomes untouchable is almost always built in private. And near the end, I'm going to show you the one shift that separates people who are emotionally ruled by the world from those rare individuals whose very presence begins to command respect without asking for it. Because once you see this clearly, you will never look at your relationships, your attention, or your own pain the same way again. And the truth is, nobody caring the way you hoped may feel like the harshest lesson of your life. But it may also be the beginning of your freedom. Nobody cares about you, and that might be the best news you'll ever hear. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. When was the last time you sat in silence and realized that most of the people you think about every day barely think about you at all? Not because they hate you. Not because they're cruel. But because everyone is busy fighting their own invisible battles. Think about the last time you sent a message and waited for the reply. You glanced at your phone once. Then again. Then again. You tried to act normal. Tried to focus on something else. But part of your mind stayed there, waiting. You replayed the last conversation. You wondered if you said something wrong. Maybe you typed too much. Maybe you sounded too cold. Maybe you sounded too eager. And then the message finally came. Or worse. It didn't. And in that small moment, something inside you shifted. Not dramatically. Not loudly. But quietly. A small part of your peace became dependent on someone else's attention. Now imagine multiplying that moment across years. Across friendships. Across relationships. Across workplaces. Across social media. Across every situation where your sense of worth becomes connected to how someone else responds to you. This is one of the quiet traps of modern life. A trap so subtle that most people live inside it for decades without realizing it. Because we are taught a story from the beginning. A comforting story. A socially acceptable story. The story that if you are kind enough, if you are understanding enough, if you are patient enough, if you explain yourself clearly enough, eventually people will see you. Eventually they will appreciate you. Eventually they will understand your intentions. But history, and human nature, tell a very different story. Machiavelli wrote something brutally honest about human behavior. He observed that people are far more likely to respect strength than to reward goodness. Not because people are evil, but because human attention is limited. People notice what is strong, what is decisive, what stands on its own, not what quietly hopes to be understood. The Stoics understood something similar long before social media, long before modern work culture, long before the endless noise of modern life. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journal, words that were never meant for the public. You should not expect other people to think about you the way you think about yourself. That sentence sounds simple. But if you really absorb it, it can change the way you live. Because most of the anxiety people carry today is built on a silent assumption. The assumption that other people are watching. Watching closely. Judging constantly. Measuring your success. Evaluating your decisions. But if you step back and observe the world honestly, you notice something strange. Everyone is doing the same thing. Everyone believes they are the center of everyone else's attention. And because of that illusion, almost no one is actually paying attention. This is the invisible audience. The crowd that exists mostly inside your head. The silent jury you imagine evaluating every decision you make. You hesitate before speaking because of them. You soften your opinions because of them. You adjust your personality because of them. You replay conversations because of them. But most of the time, they're not there. The world is far less focused on you than you think. And strangely, that realization can feel both terrifying and liberating at the same time. Terrifying because it removes a comforting illusion. Liberating because it gives you something powerful back. Your attention. Because attention is the most valuable currency you have. More valuable than money. More valuable than status. More valuable than approval. Where your attention goes, your life follows. And many people slowly lose years of their lives investing that attention in the wrong places. They monitor other people's moods. They analyze other people's reactions. They replay other people's words. They try to decode hidden meanings in messages. They adjust themselves again and again in order to maintain harmony. But harmony built on constant self-adjustment is not peace. It's slow self-erasure. Machiavelli saw this dynamic clearly in political life. A ruler who constantly tried to please everyone eventually lost the respect of everyone. Because people sense instability. They sense hesitation. They sense when someone is negotiating with their own identity. And human beings, consciously or unconsciously, respond differently to someone who stands firmly in themselves. The Stoics approached this from another angle. They believed peace comes from focusing only on what is truly under your control. Your actions. Your discipline. Your judgments. Your character. Not the reactions of other people. Not their opinions. Not their approval. Yet modern life trains people to do the exact opposite. You open social media and immediately see numbers. Views. Likes. Comments. Reactions. Signals of attention. Signals of validation. Signals that tell you how much the world is noticing you. Over time, those signals quietly reshape your behavior. You begin to post not what is true, but what will be received well. You speak not what you believe, but what will avoid conflict. You show not who you are, but what keeps your place secure. And little by little, without realizing it, you begin living inside a performance. A performance designed for an audience that rarely watches as closely as you think. This is why so many people feel exhausted today. Not because life is necessarily harder than it was in the past, but because they are running two lives at once. The life they are actually living, and the life they are managing for public perception. Two identities. Two standards. Two versions of themselves. And maintaining that split identity drains enormous energy. Energy that could have been used for something far more important. Building a life that stands on its own. The strange truth is this. The moment you stop trying to control how everyone perceives you, you reclaim a massive amount of psychological energy. Energy that was previously trapped in speculation. Did they misunderstand me? Do they think I'm rude? Did I explain that clearly enough? Should I send another message? Should I clarify what I meant? These small internal negotiations happen thousands of times in modern life. Each one seems insignificant. But together, they slowly pull your attention away from the only place where real power exists. Your own actions. Your own growth. Your own direction. Because the people who eventually become hard to manipulate, hard to intimidate, hard to emotionally destabilize, share one quiet characteristic. They stopped living inside the imagined reactions of others. Not in a bitter way. Not in a hostile way. But in a grounded way. They simply moved their center of gravity back inside themselves. And once that shift happens, something interesting begins to change in how the world responds to you. But before we get there, we need to talk about another uncomfortable truth. One that most people resist for years before they finally accept it. Your pain matters deeply to you. But to the rest of the world, it matters far less than you hope. And understanding why is one of the most important steps toward emotional independence. The harsh truth about your pain. There is another realization most people resist for years before finally accepting it. Your pain matters deeply to you. But to the rest of the world, it matters far less than you hope. Not because people are heartless. Not because they lack empathy. But because no one experiences life from inside your mind except you. Imagine this. You have a difficult day. Something happens at work. Or a relationship begins to fall apart. Or someone you trusted suddenly becomes distant. You try to explain it to someone close to you. You describe the situation. You talk about what was said. What wasn't said. What you think it means. They listen. They nod. They might even say something supportive. I'm sorry that happened. That must be frustrating. I understand. And for a moment, you feel relief. But an hour later, they return to their own life. Their responsibilities. Their stress. Their relationships. Their problems. Meanwhile, you remain inside the experience. You go home and the thoughts continue. You replay the conversation. You analyze every detail. You wonder what you could have done differently. You imagine alternative outcomes. You imagine different words you could have said. This difference between shared sympathy and lived experience is one of the most important emotional realities of adulthood. No one can carry your internal world for you. They can walk beside you. But they cannot walk inside your mind. And this is where many people unknowingly create emotional dependence. They begin expecting others to regulate their emotional state. They expect reassurance to calm their anxiety. Validation to stabilize their self-worth. Understanding to resolve their internal confusion. But this expectation slowly creates a fragile life. Because it places the control of your emotional stability in someone else's hands. And the world rarely protects people who hand over that kind of power. Machiavelli observed something similar in the political world. Leaders who constantly needed approval from others were easy to manipulate. Because anyone who controlled the approval controlled the leader. The same dynamic appears in everyday life. When someone senses that your emotional stability depends on their response, they gain influence over your behavior. Sometimes they use that influence intentionally. Other times they don't even realize it. But the effect is the same. Your mood rises and falls based on their attention. Your confidence rises and falls based on their validation. Your peace rises and falls based on their understanding. And slowly, without realizing it, you give away the most important form of control you have. Control over your own emotional ground. The Stoics approached this problem very differently. They did not expect the world to constantly affirm them. They expected the opposite. They assumed misunderstanding. They assumed indifference. They assumed that other people would mostly be occupied with their own concerns. And because of that expectation, they built their emotional stability internally. Epictetus said something that sounds harsh at first, but becomes incredibly freeing once you understand it. He said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." In other words, stop negotiating your peace with public opinion. Because once your peace depends on universal understanding, you will almost never have peace. Modern culture quietly encourages the opposite approach. It tells you that being understood is essential. That expressing your feelings constantly will create resolution. That if you explain yourself clearly enough, people will finally see your perspective. Sometimes that is true. But very often, it isn't. Because many conflicts in life are not caused by misunderstanding. They are caused by misaligned interests. Someone benefits from the situation remaining exactly the way it is. Someone prefers their version of events. Someone values convenience more than truth. And in those moments, no amount of explanation will create the understanding you are hoping for. The Stoics recognized this reality long ago. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "When someone does wrong, it is because they think it is right." In other words, people rarely behave badly because they believe they are villains. They behave according to their own priorities. And those priorities often have nothing to do with your emotional comfort. Once you see this clearly, something important changes. You stop trying to control how other people interpret your experience. And you begin focusing on something far more powerful. How you respond to it. This is where emotional independence begins. Not in denying pain. Not in pretending you don't care. But in refusing to outsource the responsibility for your stability. Because the truth is, healing rarely happens in dramatic conversations. It happens in quiet decisions. The decision to sleep instead of replaying the argument in your head. The decision to go outside and walk instead of refreshing your messages. The decision to focus on your work instead of analyzing someone's silence. The decision to invest your energy in building something real instead of chasing emotional closure. These decisions are not glamorous. They do not produce instant relief. They do not guarantee that the other person will understand you. But over time, they rebuild something inside you. Self-trust. The confidence that even when the world is confusing, you can still stabilize yourself. And once that self-trust grows strong enough, you stop asking the world to constantly confirm your worth. You begin creating evidence of it through your actions. But before we talk about that shift, we need to address another trap that quietly keeps people emotionally dependent. A trap that has become far more powerful in the modern world. The endless search for validation. Because validation, when misunderstood, can quietly reshape your entire life. And most people don't realize how deeply they have been conditioned to chase it. Until one day they notice something unsettling. Their sense of worth rises and falls with other people's reactions. And when that happens, your life is no longer entirely your own. The validation economy. There is something strange about the world we live in today. Never before in history have human beings had so many ways to measure attention. Views. Likes. Comments. Followers. Reactions. Tiny digital signals that appear instantly on a screen. Each one telling you, in a subtle way, whether the world noticed you. At first it feels harmless. You post something. People react. You feel seen. You feel acknowledged. You feel, for a brief moment, connected. But over time something far more powerful begins to happen. Your brain starts linking attention with value. The more reactions you receive, the more important you feel. And the fewer reactions you receive, the more invisible you begin to feel. Psychologists call this intermittent reinforcement. It is the same mechanism used in slot machines. Unpredictable rewards create stronger addiction than predictable ones. Sometimes the post performs well. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the message is answered instantly. Sometimes it's ignored. Sometimes someone gives you intense attention. Sometimes they disappear for days. And that unpredictability keeps the mind hooked. Checking. Refreshing. Waiting. Watching. This is the modern validation economy. A system where attention has become one of the most powerful currencies in society. And like all currencies, people begin adjusting their behavior to obtain more of it. You say what gets approval. You hide what might cause friction. You soften your opinions. You present the most acceptable version of yourself. Not because someone directly forced you to, but because the environment quietly rewards it. Machiavelli would have recognized this dynamic immediately. In political life, he observed that people respond differently to strength and weakness. Not morally, but practically. Strength creates certainty. Weakness invites negotiation. The more you seek approval, the more your identity becomes negotiable. And people sense that, even when they can't explain it consciously. This is why someone who constantly tries to explain themselves often loses respect. Not because explanation is wrong, but because repeated explanation signals instability. It signals that your sense of self depends on external agreement. And human beings instinctively trust people who appear grounded in themselves. Think about a simple situation. You share an opinion in a group conversation. Immediately you notice someone disagreeing. You feel a small tension inside your chest. And before you even realize it, you begin adjusting. Well, what I really meant was, maybe I didn't explain that clearly. I'm not saying I'm right, but these small verbal corrections happen automatically. They seem harmless, but over time they reshape how you move through the world. Because the moment you begin negotiating your identity for approval, you stop standing on solid ground. And once that happens, something subtle shifts in how people treat you. They begin testing the boundaries. They begin pushing slightly further. They begin observing how easily your position changes. Not out of cruelty, but out of instinct. Human beings constantly read signals of stability. The Stoics approached this differently. They believed that external approval was unreliable by nature. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly, do not waste the remainder of your life worrying about other people. Not because other people don't matter, but because your attention is finite. And once it becomes dominated by the reactions of others, you slowly lose the ability to direct your own life. This is why many people feel exhausted today. Not physically, but mentally. Their minds are constantly scanning for signals. Did someone like the post? Did they read the message? Why haven't they replied? Did that comment mean something? Did that tone change? Each of these questions seems small, but multiplied across hundreds of interactions, they quietly consume enormous psychological energy. Energy that could have been used to build something real. Your health. Your skills. Your discipline. Your independence. But instead that energy is spent monitoring reactions. This is one of the most expensive habits modern people develop. Because it steals time from the only activities that actually create power in your life. And the more you rely on validation, the more fragile your stability becomes. Because validation is never permanent. One day people praise you. Another day they criticize you. One moment you feel admired. The next moment you feel ignored. If your identity depends on those reactions, your emotional state will constantly fluctuate with them. But something interesting happens when a person stops chasing validation. At first, they become less predictable, less reactive, less eager to explain themselves. They stop adjusting every opinion to maintain approval. They stop monitoring every reaction. And instead, they begin paying attention to something far more important: their own standards. This is where the Stoic philosophy begins to reveal its deeper power. Because Stoicism is not about suppressing emotions. It is about redirecting attention away from external reactions toward internal discipline. When your standards come from within, external approval loses much of its control over you. You still listen to feedback. You still respect other people. But your identity is no longer dependent on their agreement. And once that shift happens, something very interesting occurs in how the world responds to you. The people who once influenced your emotional state easily lose much of that influence. Because emotional dependence requires a very specific structure. It requires one person whose reactions control another person's stability. Remove that structure, and the influence disappears. This is why silence can become one of the most powerful forms of strength. Not silence as punishment. Not silence as manipulation. But silence as independence. The ability to step back without panic. To observe without reacting. To continue moving forward without constantly explaining yourself. This kind of silence confuses people at first. Because they are used to emotional negotiation. They expect reactions. They expect explanations. They expect visible responses. But when those reactions disappear, something interesting happens. The dynamic changes. The person who once depended on validation begins standing on their own ground. And when that happens, respect often follows. Not immediately. Not dramatically. But gradually. Because people trust stability. They trust consistency. They trust individuals who are not easily pulled off their path. But to reach that point, you must first learn something most people avoid. How to tolerate silence. How to tolerate misunderstanding. How to tolerate moments where your intentions are not immediately recognized. Because the moment you no longer rush to correct every perception, you reclaim something incredibly valuable. Your direction. And once your direction becomes stronger than your need for validation, you begin to move differently through the world. But before that transformation fully takes hold, there is another uncomfortable step. One that many people struggle with more than anything else. Learning to stop performing for the invisible audience. Because once you realize how much of your behavior has been shaped by imagined judgment, you begin to see your life very differently. And that realization can change everything. The invisible audience. There is a moment that happens quietly in many people's lives. A moment when they suddenly realize that much of what they do is not actually for themselves. It is for the perception of others. Think about the last time you made a decision and immediately imagined how someone else would react. Maybe you were about to say something honest in a conversation. But before the words left your mouth, another thought appeared. How will this sound? So you adjusted the sentence. You softened the edges. You chose safer words. Not because they were more truthful, but because they were more acceptable. This small adjustment happens constantly in modern life. At work. In friendships. In relationships. On social media. It rarely feels dramatic. Most of the time it feels normal. But over time these small adjustments create a subtle shift in how you live. Instead of asking one simple question, what is true for me? You begin asking a different question. How will this look to them? And once that question becomes dominant, you begin living inside what psychologists sometimes call the imagined audience. A mental crowd that silently watches everything you do. A crowd that judges your decisions. Your words. Your identity. Your success. Your failure. But here is the strange truth about that crowd. Most of the time, it exists only inside your mind. Because everyone else is busy imagining their own audience. Everyone else is also adjusting themselves. Also wondering how they appear. Also replaying their own conversations. Also worrying about how they are perceived. This creates a strange paradox of modern life. Millions of people performing for each other. While almost no one is actually watching as closely as everyone believes. Machiavelli understood something similar in the political arena. He observed that rulers often feared public opinion far more than necessary. Not because public opinion was irrelevant, but because it was unstable, inconsistent, distracted. People's attention moved quickly. What outraged them today would be forgotten tomorrow. And because of that instability, those who constantly tried to satisfy public perception often exhausted themselves without ever achieving lasting security. The same dynamic appears in everyday life. If your behavior is constantly shaped by imagined judgment, you become reactive. Your direction shifts depending on who is present. Your confidence fluctuates depending on who approves. Your identity becomes something flexible. Something adjustable. Something negotiable. And people notice that. Even if they cannot explain why. Human beings have a remarkable ability to detect stability. When someone speaks calmly and consistently. When someone's actions align with their principles. When someone does not rush to defend themselves. There is a subtle signal of strength. Not aggressive strength. Not loud dominance. But grounded certainty. And certainty changes how others treat you. This is one of the quiet truths that Machiavelli wrote about. People are far more influenced by visible stability than by verbal justification. You can explain your intentions for hours. But if your behavior appears uncertain, those explanations rarely create lasting respect. On the other hand, a person who acts with quiet consistency often gains respect without needing to speak very much at all. The Stoics approached this from an internal perspective. They believed that the greatest source of human suffering came from confusing two things. What you control. And what you don't. You do not control how people interpret your actions. You do not control their assumptions. You do not control the stories they tell about you. But you do control your behavior. Your discipline. Your standards. Your direction. The moment you clearly separate those two categories, something inside you becomes lighter. Because you stop fighting battles that were never yours to win. You stop trying to control every perception. You stop correcting every misunderstanding. You stop negotiating your identity in every conversation. Instead, you begin focusing on something far more powerful. Consistency. Consistency in how you work. Consistency in how you treat others. Consistency in the standards you apply to yourself. Over time, consistency becomes a form of evidence. People may misunderstand you once. They may misinterpret you twice. But when your actions remain stable over long periods, the noise slowly fades. Reality becomes harder to ignore. This is why many truly disciplined individuals appear quiet. Not because they lack thoughts, but because they no longer feel the need to explain themselves constantly. Their work speaks. Their behavior speaks. Their direction speaks. And once someone reaches that stage, the invisible audience loses much of its power. Because they are no longer performing. They are living. But reaching that point requires confronting another uncomfortable reality. The fact that many relationships in life are sustained not by genuine connection, but by performance. People play roles. The agreeable coworker. The endlessly understanding partner. The always available friend. Each role comes with expectations. And when you stop performing those roles, the reaction can be surprising. Some people become confused. Others become distant. A few may even become hostile. Not because you have harmed them, but because your change disrupts the pattern they were used to. This is where many people retreat back into performance. They return to being agreeable. Return to over-explaining. Return to managing everyone's comfort. Because the discomfort of change feels risky. But those who continue forward discover something important. Not every relationship needs to survive your growth. And not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. Once you understand this, you stop fighting for universal approval. And you begin focusing on building a life that does not depend on it. But to reach that level of independence, there is one more habit that must be confronted. A habit so common that most people never question it. The habit of constantly explaining yourself. Because explanation can sometimes be useful. But when it becomes a reflex, it quietly reveals something else. The fear of losing acceptance. And fear of losing acceptance is one of the easiest ways for others to influence your behavior. Stop explaining yourself. There is a habit many thoughtful people develop without realizing it. The habit of explaining themselves. Not once. Not when it is truly necessary. But constantly. You explain why you made a decision. You explain why you said something. You explain why you need space. You explain why something hurt you. You explain why your priorities have changed. And at first, this habit feels responsible. It feels mature. It feels like emotional intelligence. Because after all, communication is supposed to solve problems, right? But something strange happens when explanation becomes a reflex. The more you explain yourself, the more you invite negotiation. Every explanation becomes an opening. An opening for someone else to question your reasoning. To reinterpret your words. To challenge your boundaries. And slowly the conversation stops being about understanding. It becomes about persuasion. You begin trying to convince others that your perspective is valid. That your boundaries are reasonable. That your choices make sense. And in doing so, something subtle shifts. Your life becomes something that requires approval. Machiavelli understood this dynamic clearly. In political life, rulers who constantly justified their actions appeared weak. Not necessarily morally weak, but structurally weak. Because constant justification signals uncertainty. It signals that authority must be defended rather than assumed. And once authority must constantly be defended, It becomes easier to challenge. The same pattern appears in everyday relationships. When someone sets a boundary calmly and simply, "This doesn't work for me," there is clarity. But when that same boundary is followed by paragraphs of explanation, something else enters the conversation: doubt. And people often respond to doubt instinctively. They push a little further. They ask more questions. They test the edges. Not always intentionally, but because uncertainty invites exploration. Think about a situation many people experience. You decide to change something in your life. Maybe you stop tolerating certain behavior. Maybe you begin prioritizing your work more seriously. Maybe you distance yourself from certain people. And when someone notices the change, you immediately feel pressure to explain. "I've just been really busy. I didn't mean anything by it. I hope you're not upset." These sentences appear almost automatically. They soften the shift. They attempt to preserve harmony. But they also do something else. They weaken the clarity of your decision. Because once your growth becomes something that must be justified, it stops being entirely yours. Now it exists partly inside someone else's approval. The Stoics approached life very differently. They believed clarity of action was more powerful than explanation. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself not to waste energy defending every perception. He wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." In other words, live the principle. Do not constantly explain the principle. There is something deeply stabilizing about that approach. Because it removes the pressure to control every interpretation. People may misunderstand you. They may question your motives. They may even criticize your decisions. But if your direction remains steady, those reactions eventually lose much of their power. Over time your behavior becomes the explanation. And behavior is far harder to argue with than words. This does not mean communication has no value. There are moments where honest conversation is necessary. But the difference lies in motivation. Are you explaining to share clarity? Or explaining because you fear losing acceptance? This distinction matters more than most people realize. Because fear of losing acceptance is one of the strongest forces shaping human behavior. Entire careers are built around it. Entire social identities revolve around it. People remain in environments that drain them because they fear rejection. They maintain roles that no longer fit because they fear disappointing others. They tolerate dynamics that quietly erode their confidence because they fear conflict. And each time they explain themselves excessively, they reinforce that fear. But something interesting happens when explanation stops being automatic. When someone states their position calmly, without rushing to justify it, without filling the silence with reassurance, without negotiating their boundaries, the dynamic changes. At first, the silence may feel uncomfortable, especially if you are used to smoothing every interaction. But silence creates something powerful. Clarity. It allows people to respond to the reality of your decision rather than the emotional negotiation around it. Some will accept it. Some will not. But the important shift is this. Your direction no longer depends on universal agreement. And once a person becomes comfortable with that reality, they become much harder to manipulate. Because manipulation often relies on emotional leverage. The fear of losing approval. The fear of appearing selfish. The fear of being misunderstood. Remove those fears. and the leverage disappears. This is why some individuals seem almost immune to social pressure. They are not aggressive. They are not cold. They are simply stable. Their identity does not move every time someone questions it. And stability creates a very different presence in the world. People sense it. They may not always like it, but they recognize it. And recognition often turns into respect. But there is another layer to this transformation that must be addressed. Because stopping the habit of over-explaining is only one step. The deeper step involves redirecting your attention away from other people's reactions and towards something far more productive. Your habits. Because habits build something explanations never can. Evidence. And evidence is where real confidence begins. Habits build real confidence. There is a word people use constantly today. Confidence. Everyone talks about it. How to build it. How to project it. How to fake it until you make it. But the truth is, most people misunderstand what confidence actually is. They think confidence is a feeling, a psychological state, a moment of emotional certainty. But real confidence is something far more concrete. It is evidence. Evidence that you can rely on yourself. Evidence built quietly through repeated action. Think about someone you truly trust. Not someone who talks convincingly. Not someone who appears impressive in public. But someone whose reliability you have observed over time. The person who says they will do something. And does it. Not once. Not when it is convenient. But consistently. That consistency creates trust. The same principle applies internally. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, a small piece of internal trust is built. Every time you break that promise, a small piece of that trust disappears. Over time these small decisions accumulate. And eventually they create something powerful. Self-respect. This is why discipline is not about punishment. It is about alignment. Alignment between what you say you value and what you actually do. Without that alignment, confidence becomes fragile. Because it relies on external reinforcement. Praise. Recognition. Approval. But when confidence is built through habits, it becomes far more stable. Because it is supported by evidence. Evidence that exists whether anyone notices it or not. Marcus Aurelius constantly reminded himself of this principle. Not through grand speeches, but through quiet daily practice. He would write short reflections in his journal every morning, reminding himself of the person he intended to be. And then he would try to live according to those words. Not perfectly, but consistently. That consistency gradually shapes identity. Because identity is not something you declare. It is something you demonstrate repeatedly. The modern world often reverses this order. People declare identities first, and attempt to live up to them later. But the Stoics believed the opposite approach was stronger. Build the behavior. Let identity follow. Think about a simple daily routine. You wake up earlier than necessary. Not because anyone is watching, but because you decided that discipline matters. You exercise when it would be easier not to. You focus on your work even when distraction is available. You improve a skill slowly over months or years. None of these actions produce instant recognition. But they create something much more valuable. Structure. Structure is one of the most underrated forms of personal power. Because structure reduces emotional chaos. When your habits are stable, your mood becomes less influential. You do the work whether you feel inspired or not. You maintain the routine whether motivation appears or not. This is where real confidence begins. Not in emotional intensity, but in reliable behavior. Machiavelli observed a similar principle in political leadership. Leaders who appeared unpredictable lost trust quickly. Not because unpredictability was always wrong, but because consistency creates a sense of security. People trust systems they can understand. And the same applies internally. When your behavior becomes consistent, your mind begins trusting itself. You stop questioning every decision. You stop negotiating every action. You simply move. And movement creates momentum. Momentum is another powerful force that habits produce. Once a routine becomes stable, breaking it requires effort. In other words, discipline eventually becomes easier than disorder. This is why the early phase of building habits feels difficult. You are constructing something new. A structure that does not yet exist. But once that structure stabilizes, it begins supporting you automatically. And slowly, something interesting begins to happen. External validation becomes less important. Because your sense of progress is no longer dependent on recognition. You know what you are building. You see the evidence every day. You feel the difference in how you move through the world. And once that internal evidence becomes strong enough, something shifts in how others perceive you as well. Not immediately, but gradually. People begin noticing stability. They notice consistency. They notice that you no longer react emotionally to every situation. And stability changes social dynamics. Because people instinctively respect individuals who appear grounded. Not loud. Not aggressive. But steady. Steady individuals are difficult to manipulate. Difficult to intimidate. Difficult to destabilize emotionally. And that quiet stability is exactly what Stoic philosophy was designed to cultivate. But habits alone are not the full picture. Because there is another transformation that must occur if someone truly wants to become emotionally independent. A transformation involving something many people struggle to accept. Rejection. Because rejection, when misunderstood, can destabilize even the strongest habits. But when understood correctly, it becomes one of the most powerful tools for growth. And learning to see rejection clearly is the next step toward becoming someone the world cannot easily shake. Rejection, closure, and emotional power. There are few experiences that affect people more deeply than rejection. Not because rejection is always dramatic. Often it is subtle. A message that stops being answered. A relationship that slowly becomes distant. A job opportunity that disappears without explanation. A friend who stops calling. No argument. No clear conflict. Just distance. And that distance creates a question that can echo inside the mind for weeks. What happened? This question can become surprisingly powerful. Because when the mind does not receive an explanation, it begins creating one. You replay every conversation. You analyze every word. You search for the exact moment where something might have gone wrong. Maybe you said too much. Maybe you said too little. Maybe you appeared too confident. Maybe you appeared insecure. The mind tries to reconstruct the past as if it were solving a mystery. But often the mystery has no satisfying solution. Because many forms of rejection are not caused by a single mistake. They are caused by shifting priorities, changing interests, different paths, or sometimes simply the natural drift that happens between people over time. Yet the mind struggles to accept that kind of ambiguity. It prefers a clear explanation, a final statement. Closure. Closure has become one of the most desired emotional experiences in modern culture. People believe that if they could just hear the full explanation, if they could understand exactly what happened, they would finally feel peace. But Machiavelli understood something uncomfortable about human nature. People rarely give explanations that threaten their own image. When relationships end, people soften the truth. They simplify it. They reshape it. Sometimes they avoid the conversation entirely. Not necessarily out of cruelty, but because clarity can be uncomfortable. And when clarity does not arrive, the mind fills the silence with imagination. Often harsh imagination. You assume the worst interpretation. You assume your value was questioned. You assume you were not enough. This is where rejection becomes dangerous. Because rejection happens twice. The first rejection is external. Someone leaves. Someone declines. Someone withdraws. But the second rejection happens internally. You begin rejecting yourself. You reinterpret the event as evidence of your own inadequacy. Your mind builds a story. A story where the rejection defines your worth. But the Stoics would have challenged that interpretation immediately. Epictetus taught that events themselves are rarely the true source of suffering. Our interpretation of those events is what creates most of the pain. Two people can experience the same rejection and respond completely differently. One person collapses internally. The other adjusts direction and continues forward. The difference is not the event. The difference is the story they tell themselves about it. Machiavelli observed something similar when studying power dynamics. Those who treat rejection as personal failure become cautious. They hesitate. They seek reassurance before acting again. And that hesitation weakens their position. But those who treat rejection as information adjust faster. They learn. They adapt. They continue moving. In other words, they refuse to let rejection define their identity. This shift sounds simple in theory. But emotionally it requires practice. Because rejection triggers something very old in the human brain. The fear of exclusion. For most of human history, exclusion from the group meant danger. Isolation meant vulnerability. So the mind reacts strongly when it senses social distance. But modern life is different. Rejection from one person does not mean rejection from the world. One closed door does not define your path. One ending does not define your value. Once you internalize that truth, something changes. You stop chasing closure. Because closure is often just another attempt to regain control over someone else's interpretation. You want them to confirm your understanding, to validate your feelings, to clarify your worth. But your worth was never theirs to determine. And waiting for their confirmation only delays your own movement forward. The Stoics practiced something called negative visualization. They intentionally imagined loss. Not to create pessimism, but to prepare the mind for reality. They reminded themselves that people may leave. Opportunities may disappear. Plans may collapse. And by accepting that possibility in advance, they removed much of its power. Because what the mind expects It can endure more easily. But modern culture often teaches the opposite. It teaches that every relationship should last. Every connection should remain. Every ending should come with explanation. Yet real life rarely follows those expectations. Sometimes people leave quietly. Sometimes doors close without warning. Sometimes you never receive the explanation you hoped for. And learning to accept that reality is one of the most powerful forms of emotional independence. Because once you stop waiting for closure, you begin creating your own. You stop analyzing every detail. You stop revisiting every conversation. You stop trying to reconstruct a perfect understanding. Instead, you redirect your attention forward. Back toward your work. Back toward your growth. Back toward the habits that build your life. And this redirection creates something powerful. Momentum. Momentum breaks the cycle of rumination. Momentum turns attention outward again. Momentum reminds you that your life continues moving. But there is one final transformation that must happen before someone becomes truly difficult to destabilize. The shift from external focus to private construction. Because the most stable individuals do not spend their time proving themselves. They spend their time building themselves. And once that building process becomes your primary focus, the world's opinions begin to lose much of their emotional weight. Private construction and becoming untouchable. There is a quiet shift that happens in the lives of certain people. It does not happen dramatically. It does not arrive with applause. It rarely attracts attention in the beginning. But once it happens, everything changes. The shift occurs when a person stops trying to be understood by everyone and starts building a life that speaks for itself. This is what we might call private construction. The process of building your strength quietly. Your discipline. Your habits. Your focus. Your boundaries. Not for the approval of an audience. Not for the validation of strangers. But because the structure itself becomes valuable. Most people never reach this stage. Because they remain trapped in the earlier phases. Seeking validation. Seeking explanation. Seeking reassurance. Seeking closure. Each of those pursuits pulls attention outward. Toward other people. Toward reactions. Toward perception. But private construction pulls attention inward. Toward actions. Toward habits. Toward direction. Marcus Aurelius spent years reminding himself of this distinction. He wrote not for fame. Not for recognition. But as a way to refine his own thinking. His journal, which we now call Meditations, was never intended to be published. It was simply a tool. A private structure for building clarity. And that idea reveals something important. The strongest foundations of character are often built away from public view. Machiavelli observed something similar when studying power. He noticed that leaders who quietly strengthened their position before announcing it were far more difficult to challenge. Power that is built slowly becomes difficult to dismantle. Because it is supported by real structure. The same principle applies to personal life. When someone spends years building discipline, their confidence is not fragile. When someone spends years improving their skills, their competence becomes visible. When someone spends years maintaining their standards, their boundaries become clear. None of these things require constant explanation. Reality eventually speaks for itself. This is why some individuals seem almost unaffected by public opinion. Not because they lack awareness, but because their identity is anchored somewhere deeper. Their sense of worth does not come from applause. It comes from alignment. Alignment between who they claim to be and how they actually live. Once that alignment becomes strong, external reactions lose much of their emotional leverage. Praise becomes pleasant but unnecessary. Criticism becomes information rather than devastation. Misunderstanding becomes tolerable. And silence becomes peaceful. This is the moment where emotional independence begins to solidify. Not independence from relationships. Not independence from community. But independence from emotional instability. Your direction no longer changes every time someone reacts. Your self-worth no longer fluctuates with approval. Your peace no longer depends on universal understanding. And once a person reaches that stage, something interesting begins to happen in how others respond to them. People sense stability. They sense self-possession. They sense that emotional manipulation no longer works easily. Machiavelli would have recognized this immediately. Because influence requires leverage. And leverage disappears when someone's emotional center is no longer external. When approval is no longer currency. It can no longer be used to control you. This is why emotionally grounded individuals often appear calm even in chaotic environments. They do not rush to defend themselves. They do not panic when misunderstood. They do not chase every reaction. Instead, they continue building. Quietly. Patiently. And over time, those quiet actions accumulate. Habits become identity. Identity becomes presence. Presence becomes influence. But the most important change happens internally. Because once you stop performing for the invisible audience, you reclaim something that was always yours. Your attention. And attention is where life is actually lived. Where you place your attention determines the direction of your days. Your weeks. Your years. If your attention is constantly pulled outward, your life becomes reactive. If your attention is anchored internally, your life becomes directed. This is why the Stoics emphasized attention so strongly. Not attention to praise. Not attention to criticism. But attention to action. Action aligned with principle. Action aligned with discipline. Action aligned with long-term direction. Over time those actions form something stronger than reputation. They form character. And character has a quiet authority that does not need constant defense. Because it becomes visible through consistency. This brings us back to the uncomfortable truth we began with. Nobody cares about you as much as you sometimes hope. But that truth is not an insult. It is an invitation. An invitation to stop building your peace on unstable ground. To stop negotiating your identity with public opinion. To stop waiting for universal understanding. And instead, to build something far more stable. A life directed by your own standards. A life supported by habits rather than validation. A life grounded in action rather than explanation. Because once you reach that point, you become difficult to manipulate. Difficult to destabilize. Difficult to control. Not because you are aggressive. Not because you are cold. But because your center of gravity has returned to where it always belonged. Inside yourself. And that is the quiet power Stoicism was designed to cultivate. Not dominance. Not fame. Not applause. But inner sovereignty. The ability to stand firmly in your own direction. even when the world around you moves unpredictably. So let's briefly return to the ideas we explored today. First, we recognize that much of modern anxiety comes from the illusion of constant observation. The imagined audience watching every decision. Second, we confronted the uncomfortable reality that other people cannot carry our internal world for us. Emotional stability must ultimately be built internally. Third, we explored how the validation economy quietly reshapes behavior, encouraging people to perform for approval rather than act from principle. Fourth, we examined the habit of over-explaining, and how constant justification weakens personal clarity. Fifth, we discussed the role of habits in building real confidence. Confidence not as emotion, but as evidence. Sixth, we examined rejection and the illusion of closure, learning to treat rejection as information rather than identity. And finally, we explored the idea of private construction, the slow, quiet process of building a life that stands independently of external validation. If there is one idea worth carrying with you after this conversation, it is this: the world becomes far less confusing when your direction becomes clear. People may misunderstand you. They may question your choices. They may disagree with your path. But when your life is built on consistent action, those reactions lose much of their power. Because the most convincing explanation is not a speech. It is a life lived with clarity. And clarity rarely needs to raise its voice. If this conversation made you reflect on your own life even a little, take a moment and share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this discussion resonated with you the most? And if you're interested in exploring more ideas from Stoic philosophy and practical psychology, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Because the strongest transformations rarely happen loudly. They happen quietly. One decision at a time.